Am I supposed to turn? Oh, it's already on. Okay. All right. Hi. It's been a really long time since I've been on a stage, and also probably the first time in years that I have been unmasked in public in a closed space. So let's see how this goes. Anyway, this is Humanizing Your Documentation. My name is Carolyn, and I'm a front-end engineer at a no-code startup called Brighter. But before becoming a software engineer, I was working full-time as a technical writer, and sometimes I still do a bit of contracting. Most recently, I participated in Google's Season of Docs at the end of 2020, where I worked with the GraphQL Foundation. If you've ever seen the FAQ page, that was me. In addition to software engineering, as Alex mentioned, I'm also a journalist, and that was what I did before I did anything tech-related. I'm currently the acting editor of futureofsex.net, which is the world's leading sex tech publication. And we're actively looking for more technical pitches. So if you have thoughts on how emerging technology is expanding human sexuality, please let me know. But anyway, back to the talk. So today I'm here to talk to you about making your documentation a bit more human-friendly. And we're going to cover a lot in the next 30 minutes, so I've included the link to the slides with all of the links to the different resources that I'll mention. I'll also show this again at the end. And for the sake of this talk, we're going to focus on external-facing documentation, so the information that describes your product to its users. And to get started, I want to start with a question. Why do we even write documentation? Is it because someone told us to do it, like maybe our managers or the acceptance criteria on our tickets? Or is it because we actually want the people using our products to accomplish their goals? Writing documentation tends to be an afterthought, and it's something that we just kind of get done. But what if we decided to give documentation the same care and consideration that we give the features that we ship? Those questions lay the foundation for what is known as use case-driven documentation. So use case-driven documentation derives from the concept of goal-driven documentation, both of which were coined and made popular by Tyner Blaine in 2006. And it works like this. Make your users' goals the focal point of your docs, instead of just describing interface elements from left to right. To illustrate why having goal-centered documentation is important, Tyner Blaine uses the example of a power drill. They say that if you were to document this drill, the way that most people document software, you'll end up with something like this. How to adjust the speed, how to change the direction, how to change the drill bit. Okay, so now you know how to operate a drill, but you don't actually know how to accomplish anything with it. These are examples of what's known as reference docs. They're information-oriented, they describe the machinery, and they're usually accurate. But if we change our perspective and focus on what it takes to do the job, and not just use the tool, we could end up with something like this. How to drill a hole in a flat surface, whether it's wood or metal. How to select the right screw for fastening items. How to stir paint with your drill. Suddenly, the documentation is helping us achieve our goals. To begin to understand why this approach is successful, we need to think about that first question again. Why do we even write docs? And perhaps more importantly, we need to be asking, who do we write documentation for? And the answer is pretty straightforward. Humans. Yes, yes. With the development of sophisticated bots and AI, this answer could change very soon. But for now, most software documentation is written with the idea that humans will read it. And humans need that guidance that documentation is meant to provide. That's why those same principles from the drill can apply to our software products. Yes, we want to write documentation to teach people how to work our software, but we also want people to be able to, achieve their goals and solve their problems using our software. So let's apply this idea to something a little bit more applicable to our industry, say Slack. Because I know they have a developer portal, I crawled their site for examples a while back, and these were a few of the titles that I found. As expected, we have those information-oriented reference docs. They teach us about making our messages interactive, how to subscribe to event types, and the differences between the Events API and the real-time messaging API. That's nice, but even as someone who uses Slack daily, I'm still not 100% sure why I would need a feature like this. So this is an extremely outdated screenshot from the same docs, but a different page. But notice how they're not only giving us use cases, create simple workflows, build bots, but they're also outlining what we can accomplish. We can create that simple workflow by having our app respond to user activities, or we can build bots to automate various tasks. Plus, it points you directly to those reference docs that we mentioned on the previous slide. So now that we generally understand kind of what use case-driven documentation is, let's look at a higher level outline of this idea. So when you develop a use case, you typically start with a goal. And if you're using something like use case-driven development or something similar, your workflow could look something like this. You'll define the functional requirements, you'll design the product, then you'll implement the feature. What most documentation is doing, however, is starting here at the implementation phase. And, this is okay. It's once you finish the feature, it works, the docs get done, mostly. But what a use case-driven approach is suggesting is that you start at, maybe you guessed it, the use case. And the beauty of this is that you can design your documentation simultaneously with the features that you're developing. And when we use a structured approach like this, we have an established framework for defining the problems that our software will solve. We articulate how people can solve those problems with use cases, and these use cases define exactly what we need to document. So this is cool. I like it. Sounds good. But it doesn't actually happen like this, even with the best intentions. So one of the problems with the use case-driven approach is that it requires a fundamental shift to how and when your team tackles documentation. And those reference docs, the ones that explain what the software can do, those are actually why documentation has a pretty bad rep in our industry, because they tend to be really dry and they leave us wanting more. So back when I was an underappreciated technical writer, I used to feel like nobody wanted to read documentation. And it's true, people tend to visit docs when they're feeling really frustrated with the software and they're really upset that they haven't been able to solve the problem on their own. And recognizing and validating those feelings is definitely important. Those emotions really frame the reader's perspective, and they therefore should shape the mood of our docs. But now that I'm deep into the developer world, I also realize that this statement isn't entirely true. What I have realized is that people don't mind reading docs, and they might even be thankful for your documentation, as long as they're actually helpful, or at least more helpful than they are confusing. But a lot of documentation isn't, and that's why it's still a huge pain point for many developers. If you search the term or the phrase reading docs on Twitter, you'll see that most of the tweets are not positive. So here are a few that I found many years ago. Hi, I was reading your documentation and you described the data in 2 different ways. Which is correct? Thank you. The way it works is third completely different description. And Ethan actually told me that this was from a large organization. You might know them. They do a lot of work with space. So just because an organization is large and has resources doesn't mean that this magically gets better. Next one. The process of learning how to write a plugin. 1, read docs. 2, get the console log output. 3, read more. 4, try literally anything else. 5, get errors. 6, read more docs. 7, read existing plugin source. 8, notice that it's written completely differently than what the docs say. And 9, cry a little. Honestly, I go through a similar journey, but the crying just comes much, much earlier. And this one's my personal favorite. Bad documentation is bad. And even after someone else asked, if there were no docs, would it be better? Lee still said, deep thoughts, Honestly, yes, because it would waste less of my time. So yeah, people love to hate documentation. But that's because most of the documentation that they're finding doesn't fulfill their needs. Also back when I was an underappreciated technical writer, I used to think like, if only I could convince developers to care more, then maybe they'll think about crafting documentation as deeply as I did. Like I was some sort of like weird documentation evangelist that literally no one asked for. But again, now that I'm a full-time engineer, I know that that's also just not always possible. Because even if a developer really cares, they'll almost never have time to think about things like comprehensive learning journeys or doc app content architecture or debate over every little single word when your job title doesn't have the term writer in it. But there are small, tangible actions that we can take to improve our documentation, and that's what I want to focus on for this talk. So we can start by looking at the words that we're writing. There's an episode of the Write the Docs podcast with technical writer Lucy Lenore, where she makes some really great points about why the words that we choose matter. She mentioned how word choice can go a long way in promoting inclusion, and we'll cover that today. But she also mentioned that as documentation becomes more advanced, particularly through AI or helper bots, this word choice plays a huge role in how these tools learn and the subsequent materials that they'll create. And we want to make those as neutral and inclusive as possible. So that's all to say that this topic matters, whether you approach it from a technical perspective or a more human one. One blocker to this goal is insensitive language. And this one can be really tricky because across nationalities and personalities, insensitive phrasing or wording can mean a lot of different things. In this case, it includes profanity and anything else you could imagine would break a code of conduct. Take this one, for example. If the programmer wishes to uphold the invariant, he must satisfy the function's preconditions. Now, you might think that gendered language is a relatively tame example, but even so, it can have really negative effects on your community and their own sense of belonging. It's also something that you might want to keep in mind if you're coming from a language like I believe Romanian and also German, where things like servers, computers, etc., have genders. In software development, we also have these problematic, outdated, mostly racist terms that we're still using. It's fine, it's doing its thing. My computer kernel panics when it falls asleep, so I'm just hoping it seems to be doing its thing. All right. Anyway, so we have these outdated, racist terms, even though it's 2022, and terms like master-slave and blacklist, whitelist. A good rule to follow is that when you're documenting code, you don't want to make any assumptions about race, gender, religion, political orientation, or really anything else that isn't directly relevant to your product. For the previous examples, we can use these alternatives. So we have primary and replica, deny list and allow list. I've also heard block list and safe list work pretty well. And not only are these less racist, but they better describe their purpose via their semantics. Another one, probably my biggest gripe, is saying simply or easy in your documentation. So Jim Fisher opened the 2018 Write the Docs Prague conference with a talk on this topic alone. At one point, he searched the word simply on GitHub and found over 92 million references in documentation. Which is wild, because if you think about it, if you're stuck on a problem or trying to implement something, do you really want to read something that describes it as simple? What we can do is ban isolating words like easy, simple, just, obviously, from our docs. And this is already pretty common practice in technical writing, and we can use those practices to be more mindful of the words that we're choosing. If you're struggling to find alternatives, Jim Fisher, who I mentioned earlier, has some suggestions. You can be more specific. So maybe your product is easy because it's quick to set up or doesn't require much custom configuration. If that's the case, say so. You can be comparative. Something is smaller than something else. or requires fewer steps to create. You can also be absolute. It takes 5 lines of code to integrate this with your project. And when you suggest being absolute, lots of people immediately jump to time as a measure to show how easy something is. So imagine launch a website in less than 10 minutes, build your own server from scratch in 30 seconds, whatever. In this case, I would recommend to show and not tell. If you really think it takes 5 minutes to set up your tool, I would challenge you to make a video and see if that number still holds. And then I would challenge you to find someone who's never used your product and then also try to do that and see if that number still holds. Jim did this during his talk, and let's say it proved the point. So this is the part of the talk where I usually introduce linters, and it's nice, because we're developers. We have a tendency to want to automate everything. It's great. But it's important to warn that while linters can help, they aren't a replacement for human editing. And just because you're using a linter that will flag these kind of insensitive terms doesn't mean that you shouldn't still educate yourself about why these terms are harmful. That said, I'll show 2 linters that might help. So there's Alex.js, which catches polarizing language in Markdown files. You can use it on the command line or as an integration with Atom, VS Code, or even Slack. And it's also open source, so if you realize it's not catching something and you think it should, you can submit a pull request. WriteGood is another open source linter for English prose. It's available as a command line tool, and I think someone also wrote a VS Code plugin for it. Another question I get frequently is about using humor in documentation. And honestly, don't do it. Because even if you think your joke is the most hilarious thing, humor is extremely difficult to localize. So if you have translations, that can be a huge problem. It may also have legal ramifications depending on your product or the area that you work in. And more likely than not, it'll annoy your readers because they're typically trying to accomplish something and then leave. For example, here's a screenshot from a guide on how single sign-on works. About halfway through the guide, there's this text which says, "At this point, I have to show you a photo of cute kittens to keep your interest in reading further." Picture of cute kittens. Are you still here? Thanks. Or thank you. Not sure about you, but I would feel so frustrated if I'm trying to implement single sign-on and then about 8 steps into the guide ran into this. The next one might be the most common. So often what I see in documentation is that it'll have these long, verbose chunks of text with bloated language. And by this I mean overly complicated prose that are difficult to understand. And particularly for those who might have a learning disability or also aren't reading in their native language. What we want to do is choose our language intentionally. And using plain language is crucial for more inclusive documentation. One tool you can use to help is Hemingway Editor. So here you can paste and it'll highlight any long, complex sentences, unnecessary words, or words with simpler alternatives. Same with the linters. We want to be really critical about how and why we're implementing the suggestions, especially because you'll almost never satisfy Hemingway completely, and that's okay. What's important is over there on the right, there's a readability score, and we want to try to keep that down to about a grade 8 level. And don't worry about a readability score being too low, because as the amazing Ashley Bischoff once said, "No one has ever complained that something was too easy to read." And if you want more tangible examples of what plain language is in writing, I would check out her talk from Frontiers. It is gold. Unexpected errors are another common issue that people face. So while we can't necessarily prevent this through documentation alone, we can help make it better by considering and addressing common errors if you know them. This helps to reassure the users that mistakes happen and provides options for troubleshooting. When you're writing about these errors, try to explain what might happen and the potential reasons why, and then make sure to tell the reader what to do next. Here's a screenshot from the Apple II Basic Programming Manual from, yes, the 1970s. It tackles the nuances of common user errors quite well and explains a lot of syntax errors before you even start coding. So this example tells us what happened. We got a beep and the syntax error message. Why? We press return. And what to do next? Ignore it. When formatting these errors, error alerts in tutorials, Django Girls is a great resource to reference. These notes are scattered throughout the tutorial. The clear formatting allows it to be informative without being distracting to those who might not experience those errors. And I've also seen like collapsible messages work quite well. And finally, you might just be in too deep. Like imagine you work hours and hours, week after week, to build this product. You become so familiar with it to the point that you don't even cognitively recognize the core concepts as you work with them. And you forget that those concepts aren't universal. So when you go to document the product, you forget to take that step back, and then you write the docs as if you're talking to yourself. But the problem is that users won't have this same frame of reference. I mean, you built it. So any unexplained term or skipped step can really destroy that learning journey for the reader. What you need to remember is that no matter how intuitive you think your tool might be or how advanced you think your users are, everyone starts somewhere and everyone is a beginner at some point in time. What I found to be effective is to go through the entire process from start to finish and talk out loud while you're doing it. So at the same time, maybe have another colleague, preferably someone who's not working on the same project, take notes about what you're doing and make points about when they were confused or things that might be unclear. Another really practical step that we can do is to add a glossary page to our docs. On this page, you can define words in the context of your product. Then within the actual documentation, you can link to these definitions and give readers the opportunity to gain context if they need it. Python docs, for example, have a glossary page, and what I like particularly about their glossary is that they include terminal prompts and other common symbols, and they define what they mean and the situations that you might run into them. So next I want to touch on something that's almost equally as present as words in documentation, and that's code. So code snippets are very understandably common in documentation, and we should give them equal consideration to the words that we're writing. I'll start out by pointing that code snippets should never be screenshots. This is for accessibility reasons. Without alt text, then the code is unreadable for those using assistive technology. But it's also much more in your favor to write it out, because that way your readers can copy and paste things to try them out, or maybe even interact with the code directly if you have a playground embedded in your docs. As an alternative to screenshots, we can follow semantic HTML principles and use a code tag for inline code, for instance, if you're mentioning a function name within a written sentence. Then, if you want to expand that into an entire code block, we can use the pre element. This is what's being used when you use those like triple backticks in Markdown. And speaking of Markdown, code blocks are part of the Markdown spec, but syntax highlighting isn't. However, a lot of renderers like GitHub, GitLab, etc., do support syntax highlighting. You just have to make sure that you're writing the language name after the backticks. So another issue that pops up in code snippets are these nondescript variable names. So this is because like foo, bar, baz, insert other three-letter word here, they have no context and they don't have any sort of indicator for what they could be representing, which means that our readers are more likely to lose their understanding. Instead, we can use meaningful placeholders and use those as a tool for teaching. In a discussion about this, Ellie, a developer based in London, once said, "We can have variable names that are both meaningful and generic, that expose their purpose via their semantics." She uses the example of an array, and I want to dig into that a little bit further. Here is an array named Baz with two items, foo, bar. And say that I'm learning what arrays are or how to work with them. These variable names are way too abstract. So instead, we could name our array list of fruits, and we could call the items apple and banana. This is descriptive, and I understand what's going on, but we don't even need to take it that far. You could also name the array something like array_name, and then list item 1, item 2. It's not the most creative, but at least it's promoting comprehension. And now that we've covered like the literal words and code that shows up in our docs, I want to briefly talk about maintaining documentation. Well-structured content and having hierarchy clearly defined are essential for things like this. But again, it's more of an ideal than an actual reality. But it's important to consider the structure of our docs because it shapes the overall user journey and then also like crafts that experience for our readers. So we want to have a clear, easy to follow structure. And when you're writing and you're in doubt, you can aim for something like this. Talk about one specific feature, go on to explain the use cases, and finally offer solutions for tooling, integrations, etc., to lead the reader to what you think they should read next. And the final issue that I'll cover today is an issue of fit. So the product that you're documenting might not be that useful for the person reading it, and this causes a lot of confusion. So be transparent. When there's a specific use case that doesn't work, say something. You'll save people a lot of headaches in the long run, and I really promise you it won't destroy your business. So in your introductory material, for instance, you can remind people to double check that the tool is appropriate for what they're trying to accomplish. Admittedly, not a lot of products do this, probably for business reasons, I don't know. But it took me a really long time to find an example, but I did find this one from Create a New React App. First, they describe the potential use cases for integrated tool chains in the introduction. Then the first section is titled, You Might Not Need a Tool Chain, and mentions that if you're not experiencing the problems that they described, then you should probably go another route. So I hope that I've given you maybe a new tool to implement or something to add to your documentation checklists. But before I stop talking, I want to leave you with something that I learned during my time as a technical writer. So back in the days, I was working for a company called Contentful in Berlin, and when I first read through their style guide, something immediately struck me. At the very beginning, it says, "We aim for accuracy and consistency." Sure, this is the case for most docs, but what really got me was what came next. More importantly, we aim to be honest, helpful, and human. Honest, as in we communicate the pros and cons of a solution, because in doing so, we build trust. Helpful, we want our users to succeed, because their success is ultimately our success. And human, we want to feel familiar and approachable, because after all, you and everyone else reading your docs are humans too. So thank you. Here's that list of resources again, and if you want to chat about these things, I'm available on Twitter, or I'll be around the conference throughout the day. And yeah, that's the end.